Hey everybody, here comes everybody. I am worried we're not going to have as many people here tonight, but we already have a good crowd, so thank you for coming on. We're going to be watching see tonight, but
Hi, Joyce.
it's good to see all of you here and everybody in good health and smiling. It's great to see everybody, and I had an interesting discussion today with a candidate. I'm going to post it up a little bit later. Candidate for our local assembly. Her name is Lucy Volotsky. She's running for the state assembly here in our 38th district. It's a very strange situation. We have two Republicans running against each other. One of them is got a lot of backing, and one of them doesn't. And so we have Lucy, who doesn't have a lot of backing, but is very sweet and reached out to me and wanted to talk to our synagogue and to our community, and we would have had her and any other candidate, quite frankly, who wants to come. We always have them come. So we did it by Zoom. So we had a Zoom conversation today that I taped, and we'll put it up there. So Lucy, interestingly, is married to an Israeli man. There's two Republicans, her and her name is Suzette, I believe, Suzette or Susanna.
Rabbi, what kind of tape did you use?
I taped it, right. We pre-recorded, you're right. We should say we pre-recorded it. What is Suzette Valadares is her name? Yes. Suzette Martinez Valadares, who keeps running again. So there's two Republicans running against each other, and if Suzette reaches out and asks, we'll obviously have her too. But right now I think Suzette has a lot more endorsements, and but they're at very different stages of their lives. And interesting thing about Lucy is she's married to an Israeli guy named Hemi, and they own a business together, bedroom business, mattress and bedrooms. Anyways, and she's French Canadian, so she has a very thick Canadian French accent. She's a Canadian. She sounds like she's from France, kind of, but very nice. And well, again, if Suzette reaches out, we'll have her too. So again, we would have had these candidates come and be part of our synagogue service, and since we don't have a forum for that, we'll do that. So as I remind people, there's a lot of attention being paid to the national political situation, but so much of our lives are affected by our local races that I think it's really important to make people aware of what the candidates stand for, and again, people really have to remember that a lot of our lives are things happen on the local level, and for all the importance of presidential elections, I'm not minimizing them. A lot of our politics are happening right here in our own backyard. A lot of the things that affect us on a daily basis. So again, don't know what will happen in our district, but you'll see Suzette. I'll probably post it up tomorrow. I'll post up Suzette. I'll post up Lucy's interview, and then again, if Suzette reaches out, we'll have her too. So with that being said, it's good to see everybody. And again, this week's portion, I haven't posted a message yet for the week. I promise I will. Well, I shouldn't say I promise. I hope to post a message for the week. It's going to focus this week as almost everybody will. When they read the Parsha, the Torah portion of Shoftim, it's natural for us to talk about the very first words of the portion. It could be said that almost everything that people say about this portion comes from the third line of the portion, because it's so famous, it's so powerful, and when you don't talk about it, you almost have to explain why you're not focusing on that first line, that third line, right from the beginning of the portion, because it's so famous and it's so, it requires, us to think about it, and it's one of the few lines of Torah that's, you can find anywhere. And I will, hold it a second, I'm going to put it back up. This is,
You're gonna stream on Facebook?
yeah, but you know what I was just going to tell you, you can see that I was also watching baseball a few minutes ago, but I'm not going to stream that. But no, I was gonna. I also should say I know because Francine is on the line right now that the Dodgers are continuing their amazing season and batting, situation from last year. So, Francine, I think your son has it. I think he goes by RVS now. Is that? Am I right about that? Is he known that way now, Francine? I don't know. She's on mute, but anyways, it is baseball season still. So, anyways, Francine, people are giving her son a whole lot of credit for the Dodgers continuing as the batting coach, as the new guy, that she is proud of his achievements. And so I was watching baseball. No, I was not watching convention stuff. I have to admit, I do want to. You could actually see my history. So I don't want to make it seem like I'm not doing what I'll admit to what I was doing. I was watching baseball. So this week's portion is, as I said, is very famous. It means Shoftim means the word shofet. A shofet in Hebrew means a judge, a lawyer. It's somebody who's involved in law and in the root mishpat, which means a law, a rule, and a shofet is a judge or a lawyer, and there are people with the last name Shofet, indicating that at one point they had an ancestor who was a lawyer, but most likely not really a lawyer or judge, but a rabbi who would be involved in judging. And the portion begins Shoftim v'Shotrim, which it means magistrates and officials. Those are different words for essentially, again, trying to come up with the root for Shofet and Shotrim are kind of, again, people who are going to administer justice. And so we have magistrates and officials is the translation they chose here. You'll see it sometimes judges and officials or judges and ministers for all your tribes, or again amongst all of your gates, within all of your gates. So the translation here kind of captures the meaning of it, but it also in Hebrew is even somewhat more powerful, because the word sha'arecha, which means gates, teaches us that literally from the moment you come into a town, that you have to be under a law, under a rule of law. That from the moment that somebody comes into the city, they should know that they are protected by the rule of law. And this is, obviously it's conveyed in the English translation, which they translate as sharecha. Oh no, they have in settlement. Sorry, tribes they translate from this word shivtecha, which is kind of again your settlements or your against your tribal portions. But here the settlements is the word that they translated as sharecha, which means literally gates. And so this idea that literally you're protected by the rule of law from the moment you enter a city. And it says, in the places that God has given you, they shall govern the people with due justice. And again, that word there is mishpat tzedek. So mishpat tzedek is another way of saying, and again, I'm not faulting the translation, but it is also, you could say, the rule of law, that everything must be under the rule of law. And so this is, again, I'm making sure that this, I tried the Facebook on my other side of my computer, and I don't know if it's working right now, sorry. It is gonna work hopefully right now. Apologize, you're taking through this process. But anyways, so God is giving us this land, but in order for us to live in this land and in order for us to continue in safety and good health, we have to have the rule of law. It kind of goes hand in hand with the fact that when God is, whether we understand God's presence all the time, God's represented by the rule of law. And it is so powerful that the Torah puts into practice these kinds of things, which again, we take it for granted, but it's not something you can take for granted. Our ancestors didn't take it for granted, and we shouldn't take it for granted either, that there is going to be the rule of law. And again, we recognize that even though God puts this land in our under our authority, that the authority really lies within a system of justice that protects everybody. And again, the word mishpat, I'll point it out sometimes when it comes up, that it says, "You shall not judge unfairly," right? "You shall show no partiality. You shall not take bribes, for bribes blind the eyes of the discerning and upset the plea of justice." So it says right off the bat, you can't take bribes, obviously, because it perverts justice. People cannot trust the system if the system can be corrupted by money. And of course, this is an issue. It's an issue in our country. It's an issue, a thing, I think you could say one of the things that defines, some of the third world countries, that we'll call them banana republics or whatever you want to call them, these countries where people can't trust the rule of law. The reality is it pretty much comes down to the fact that people will be taking bribes, and they know that if they give enough money, that they can have the law follow their checkbook. So obviously that goes for judges and for courts and for legal situations, but it also, of course, by extension, goes through zoning and building, and in countries where you can bribe somebody and build a building that's not safe, of course, that's also taking bribes and something that corrupts and creates a system where you can't have faith in the system. Now that's obvious, and that goes without saying, and it doesn't go without saying because the Torah says it. So that comes right up the top. But I want you to pay attention to what else the Torah will say. So here we have, because it did say, by the way, "You shall not show partiality." So before it even just says taking bribes, it also says, "You shall not show partiality." And we'll come back to that, because partiality isn't always showing favor to the rich. So the next line, though, is the famous line, "Tzedek, tzedek, tirdof," which in Hebrew translates usually as "Justice, justice shall you pursue." And again, we always take some time talking about this because it's such a famous line of the Torah. Tzedek, tzedek, tirdof, which means, again, justice, justice shall you pursue, or again, however you're going to translate it, tzedek, righteousness, righteousness, but the word clearly is repeated. And so however you translate the word, it's almost always translated, though I can't say always. Somebody may have decided to translate the words differently in English. I don't know why, but usually translated, again, the repetition is a little bit of a key to understanding, of course, that these words are repeated for emphatic, for the power of stressing that this is so important, that justice needs to be pursued with full vigor, with full intention. And as Francine just chatted out, it's so relevant for today. Well, it's relevant for today, and unfortunately, it's always relevant. But yes, right now, it's very relevant because, again, it's easy for people to say, well, we need to have justice, but there has to be the reason that some people say the words are repeated is so that we have a balance between a justice system that takes into consideration the rule of law, but at the same time isn't blind to compassion and isn't blind to human frailty. That there must be a balance. But there's also this sense too that as much as we need to pursue aggressively prosecution, we also have to vigorously make sure that people are defended as well. And again, most people don't understand this until somebody in their own family is accused of a crime, and then all of a sudden people are saying, we need to have really good defense system too. Well, a lot of people don't think about that until they actually need it. And there are people who are accused unjustly of crimes that need to be protected. And Judaism recognized that people are entitled to a defense. And we had that as part of our system of law long before it was part of systems of law in other countries, in the sense that every person who came before a Jewish court had to be represented and had to be able to have witnesses testify on their behalf. So understand that Judaism had this law from a long time ago, from thousands of years ago. And one of the things that we get from the Torah and then later on from the Talmud is this understanding that Judaism didn't have courts that were made up of lawyers and judges that were necessarily separate, in the sense that the people who were as part of a court, both as lawyers and as judges, essentially were respected as officers of the court, or people who could be on one side of the tribunal, either as prosecution or defense, or also in some cases as judges. But these people moved back and forth. Now, again, today we have a system where judges have served some time as people in court, but oftentimes there's a track where people really don't spend a lot of time as lawyers, and then pretty much kind of follow a track where they're going to be judges, and don't spend enough time behind the bench, on the other side, as we would say. But it's important to also remember that the judges essentially served as part of a tribunal. And when we say tribunal, usually, we're talking about 3 judges, but that wasn't the case in Jewish tradition. When it came to cases, for example, that were maybe a capital case, you literally had a court of 80 plus judges that would be part of that tribunal, of that court. You did not get tried by a jury of your peers. You had essentially a group of always odd number of judges, whether it was 3, 11, 70, 71, 81, there was always an amount of judges, an odd number of judges, and it was always the decision was rendered by a majority of judges. It was not a jury. They were all professional judges, which, by the way, is one of the reasons why those judges had to be completely impartial and above reproach, never be in a situation where they could be bribed. Because when you have a professional, essentially a professional court and not a jury, the whole concept of having a jury of your peers, to some extent, is to make sure that you don't have a corruptible group of people. I mean, that's really a huge part of it, that you don't have a constantly impaneled, like we have grand juries, or we have, we have groups that are sometimes, in a situation where they're able to decide certain things. But when we go to court in the United States, the concept of having a jury of your peers was that you'd have a group that could not be corrupted. And of course, it sometimes happens that they are bribed, but bribing a juror is harder, which is why they keep the jurors sequestered, and why they're never known by the witnesses or the lawyers until they go to court, so that you can't get to the jurors, assumedly, not threaten them, right? Not intimidate them, but also not bribe them. Well, if you had a group of judges that were always there in court, the fear is that those people can be bribed, and those people can be intimidated, and those people can be swayed. So it was really, really important that those people could not show partiality, and that they were not going to be bribed. But we understood that in order for you to live in the land, and it says that you may thrive and occupy the land that the Lord is giving you, you must institute justice. And I will tell you that every word of this sentence is powerful and is necessary and deserves to be looked at. And so I just want to look, I'm not going to look at every word, but I will look at the next word, which is tirdof. So tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. Justice, justice, you shall pursue. So the word rodef in Hebrew, rodef, is a pursuer. What's interesting is oftentimes in legal terms, the rodef is actually somebody who you're worried about, in the sense that a rodef is a pursuer is a person that you're oftentimes scared of. And when we talk about a rodef in Judaism and in the Talmud in particular, we're usually talking about somebody that's going to cause you harm. It's usually a negative. Here, in the line in the Torah, it is that you as a member of society, that you pursue justice. And the interesting thing about it is that this concept of tirdof, which is oftentimes, again, almost like a stalker or a the way somebody pursues or chases after somebody to do them harm. The Torah is actually telling us, you do that to justice. You stalk and pursue justice like you're going to grab it and take it home with you. It is literally that kind of passion you're supposed to have for justice, which is kind of an interesting flip of the normal usage of the word. Again, even in the Torah, and again, as I said, usually we see it pop up in the Talmud as the Talmud talks about a rodef as somebody that you're allowed to stop. The Talmud is very clear, by the way. The Torah doesn't get into the specifics of this, but the Talmud does, which the Talmud will say that when someone is pursuing you to do you harm, you're absolutely allowed to kill them if they're pursuing you. The Talmud is not ambiguous about this, about that point at all. A rodef is allowed to be destroyed before they hurt you. You don't have to wait for somebody to attack you. If they are chasing you, and if you believe that they're going to do you harm, and they're menacing or whatever, however you assess that, you are allowed to stop them. The Talmud is very, very clear about that. So the rodef, the word is oftentimes used in a negative connotation, in a negative situation. Here, it's clearly used, and I was going to say, sometimes in the Torah, it's used in a negative way too. Here, it's clearly used in a positive way, in the sense that you are supposed to aggressively chase after justice. And then there's this understanding, by the way, like we say in English, right? In our Constitution, when we talk about the pursuit of happiness, it's not a foregone conclusion. You're not guaranteed it, but you're encouraged, and you're not guaranteed happiness, but you're guaranteed that you can pursue it. There's an understanding that it's not always there, but you have to strive for it. You have to pursue it. You have to work at it. We can't guarantee it, but we can guarantee, or at least encourage you to try to do it. And so there's this understanding that you don't stop working at it. You never take for granted that you're going to have justice. You never assume that it's going to fall in your lap. You never assume that it's easy. You assume that you're going to have to chase after it. You assume that you're going to have to work at it. You're going to assume that you're going to have to sometimes search for it in the strangest places, and that you're going to have to really be aggressive in trying to create it and trying to get a hold of it. So this understanding of tzedek, you shall pursue, is why the word tirdof is always has to have that connotation of not just seeking it, not just looking for it, but pursuing it, chasing after it. Again, really stalking it. It is always supposed to be in the forefront of your mind. It's supposed to be an obsession for you, if you will. And so this phrase, tzedek tirdof, justice shall you pursue, has been emblazoned on the top of courtrooms. Oftentimes lawyers will have it in their offices, and it is a line from Deuteronomy, from our Torah portion, which again, when people read this Torah portion, usually they're focusing on it. Not always, but often when you're doing it for the first time. But then we move into some other stuff which we've read about in the past portions, which is this law against putting up any kind of idol. And in this case, it says, don't establish a sacred post, any kind of pole beside the altar of the Lord your God that you make, or erect a stone pillar, for such the Lord your God detests. So what's interesting about this is that it seems like a pretty simple, not very ornate type of idol, simply a pole, a sacred pole, or a stone pillar. These seem pretty unadorned, simple, not very not very fancy type of statues or idols, but these were dangerous too. And the Torah is saying this because they were very, very common in the ancient world. These type of sacred pillars were everywhere. And the Torah tells us, interestingly, or the Tanakh, the Bible tells us later on in the book of Kings, that indeed the kings of Israel, Jewish kings, were establishing these cultic items from other people, pagan, Canaanite statues or pillars or again, sacred posts in the temple in Jerusalem. So this 100% happened. So that, of course, then it begs the question, was this written after it already happened? And after the Israelites, the Jews were upset about what had happened with this, because these were clearly pagan items. I will tell you that the word sacred post here is the Asherah. It says the Asherah, which is probably a feminine cultic thing, because it's a female word, but it also says kol eitz, which is what they translate as the word for pole, but it is the word literally in Hebrew for tree. So it's a type of a sacred tree, probably a fertility symbol. Might have also been connected to this stone pillar, which is translated, that's the word matzeva in Hebrew, that this might have also been a cultic, maybe even a phallic symbol that was used, a stone pillar, and that the tree was maybe a feminine fertility symbol. Interestingly, of course, when we read this today, there's an interesting issue, because there is this understanding that maybe this tree sounds a little bit like a Christmas tree. Now, what's interesting about it, of course, is that a Christmas tree did start out, obviously, as everybody knows, as a pagan symbol, which was then incorporated and reimagined, repurposed by early Christians, or Christians from, I wouldn't say early, but Christians from the Middle Ages, as a symbol that could be used and incorporated into Christianity without it having that pagan symbolism anymore. But people knew that in countries, especially during the wintertime, where they brought in an evergreen tree, that this was a symbol of fertility, a symbol of life during the winter. In other societies, there's a maypole, and there's statues or trees that are used for fertility symbols that have also kind of been repurposed and reimagined, and people don't talk about the pagan origins of them anymore, or actually now they're kind of reappropriating or reconnecting to their pagan elements out in the open. But for a long time, people would kind of not talk about the pagan aspects of these things, and they just celebrated with a maypole or with some of these fertility objects, and then didn't talk about where they came from. But Judaism, again, frowned on any type of idolatry, any type of symbolism that, again, would lead people away from God. And the feeling here, of course, is that this is going to take people into other religious directions. And it says quite specifically here that these poles and these altars, these sacred posts, would be established by the altar, which is the mizbeach, the altar that was used by the priests. So what it tells us is that this isn't just about putting them up in your home. There were people that were literally putting them up into the temple in Jerusalem. And so this is something that was really, really a problem. And we know from the Bible itself, we know from the text that it happened. So it's not theoretical, it happened. And it's something, again, that either the people were directed in the first place not to do, or they're being directed later on not to do it, but that they had been doing it. They had been erecting these sacred poles. So it's really, again, for us, we don't deal with idolatry and paganism and these type of fertility objects anymore. But it was a big issue for our ancestors. And you can see it comes right after this discussion of justice. It's no issue going into a discussion of idolatry, literally in the next line. So you can see it's really, really, again, a little bit of jumping around, but we are going to come back to the justice part, I promise. But here's some more of our laws that we get here in Shoftim, which again started out with justice and are now moving into some religious things here. Um, you shall not sacrifice to the Lord your God an ox or a sheep that has any defect of a serious kind, for that is abhorrent to the Lord your God. So you don't give your leftover or your badly your bad offering, your bad uh, flock for the offering. Kind of makes sense. And here it says something that we also kind of have read in different versions before. If there is found among you in one of your settlements that the Lord your God is giving you, a man or woman who's affronted the Lord your God and transgressed his covenant, God's covenant, turning to the worship of other gods, bowing to them, bowing down to them, the sun or the moon or any of the heavenly hosts, something that I never commanded. And again, it says the sun, the moon, and all of the stars of the sky, and they translate it as the heavenly host. But I will tell you that, again, I think you figured it out from the context, but they're talking about really right here, the constellations. They're talking about people who are worshiping the stars and specifically things that you saw in the heavens. So again, people did it back then. Is this a commandment against zodiac and that type of stuff? No, we're not talking about people that are looking at their zodiac signs. We're talking here about people that are literally worshiping stars, the representation of stars as gods. Or again, looking up at the sky, seeing that star and saying that's that God, and that's the God that we worship at this time of year, which of course is what the Greeks and several of the ancient civilizations that the Jews were around were worshiping. The Egyptians and pretty much everybody. Again, we don't know that much about the constellations that were worshipped exactly, but we do get some of them. We get a few of them in the Torah. Pleiades, Orion, some of them are mentioned specifically later on in the Bible, but again, people would worship those stars as gods. So you can guess what's coming up. You're not supposed to worship them. And though you have been informed or have learned of that, then you shall make through a thorough inquiry. If it is true that the fact is established that the important thing was perpetrated in Israel, you shall take that man or that woman who did that wicked thing out to the public place. And again, the punishment is you shall stone them, man or woman, to death. So again, the punishment for this type of polytheism, this type of worshiping other gods, was being stoned to death. And this is the prescribed method of execution for people that were violating the commandments against idolatry and that were worshiping other gods. Polytheism too. So what does it say? A person shall be put to death only on the testimony of two or more witnesses. He must not be put to death on the testimony of a single witness. We get back to the issue of justice here. So here we have a penalty of death, and the Torah tells us that as part of that, you cannot execute somebody without there being witnesses, without there being a trial. So we kind of get back to this, this understanding of justice and how it is put in place. How is justice enacted when it comes to a capital case? And I will tell you later on, the Talmud goes even further into how many witnesses, because the Talmud says you can't just have two witnesses. You have to have witnesses that can testify to the competency of the witnesses that testified. And then they said you have to have witnesses that would testify to the competency of those witnesses. So by the time you're done with it, the whole town has to be involved in the court case. So they made it virtually impossible to execute somebody because there had to be complete, without a doubt, uncertainty that the person had committed the crime. And here's what the Torah says. Again, that's later on in the Talmud. But what the Torah says, it says, let the hands of the witnesses be the first against him to be put to death. And then and the hands of the rest of the people come after that. Thus you will sweep out evil from your midst. And so what's interesting about this is that everybody has to participate in the punishment. It's not left to executioners. It's not left to some man under a hidden mask that everybody had to be involved in it because they understood that this was the only way for the community to take this seriously and to understand that we don't take this punishment lightly. And we also recognize that it is incumbent on everybody in the community to enforce the law, not to a certain segment of the population. And of course, what also happens is that the people who testify against these people, the people who are involved in it, can't run away and hide behind, somebody else. They actually have to be the people who are involved in the death penalty here. So they can't just run away and say, "Oh, I've said, what I need to say, and now I'm done." It didn't work like that. You actually had to be there. So back to again to law. And it says, if a case is too baffling for you to decide, be it a controversy over homicide, civil law, or assault, the matters of dispute in your courts, you shall promptly repair to the place that the Lord your God will have chosen, which again is Jerusalem, but doesn't say Jerusalem here because it hadn't happened yet. And appear before the Levitical priest or the magistrate in charge at that time and present your problem. When they have announced when they have announced to you the verdict in the case, you shall carry out the verdict that is announced to you from that place that the Lord chose, observing scrupulously all their instructions to you. So what it tells us is that, again, there might be a time when you have to go to a higher level of justice. This is kind of like, again, what happens when your local court can't come up with an answer. And so in this case, you go to Jerusalem, and you actually you're now engaging not only lawyers, but priests.
And is that like going to the Supreme Court? If you can't solve it at the lower levels, you go to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, except in this case, it really probably was serious murder cases too. So it would literally be like, and it does happen in other countries, where when there are cases that are of a national level or are appealed, the verdicts that are appealed, which are almost always appealed, but when the upper court say, yeah, we need to hear this, and it depends again on but I'm talking about I'm not talking about in Somalia. I'm talking about in Italy. You can appeal a murder charge to the national court, and then you're being heard on a national level. So, I mean, our Supreme Courts don't hear murder cases. I mean, that's not their role, right? So their role is really to decide constitutional issues and to kind of deal with on a macro level, even though the cases are obviously individual cases when they start, right? They generally don't decide on a I can't think of cases where it's been a death penalty case on one person, but maybe there have been, but it's not. It would be such a unique situation where they're deciding on an individual's life or death. We don't do that, right? We essentially, interestingly, we generally keep those cases even when they're appealed. We keep them on a local, on a state level or a county level. They don't escalate to a national level. In this case, ancient Israel had murder cases essentially that would go to, as you're saying, Joyce, a Supreme Court, which was a court that would determine these cases that needed to be arbitrated at the highest level. And of course, what's interesting about it is that they actually involve priests. So at a certain point, they're literally turning it over to God. I mean, they're basically, let's have the people who are communicating with God, somehow they'll be able to help us, in deciding these cases. What's interesting today is when I get called for jury duty, all I have to do is tell someone I'm a rabbi. When I'm on the panel, I'm done. I mean, if I tell them what I do, they never get on. I never get on a jury because as soon as they hear that I'm a rabbi, they won't take me ever. Never. It's never gotten beyond. Oh, you're a rabbi? Okay, well, as soon as that comes out, I'm done. There's even a case where I wanted to be on the jury. I have to tell you, I had a case where I was like, please, I want to be here on this jury. And as soon as they said, what do you do? And I said, you're out. I'm like, no, I want to see this case. It was in San Fernando court, and it was a domestic abuse where it was the woman that was being charged for the domestic abuse, and the guy was the victim. And I have to say, I wanted to hear that story. I needed to hear that story, but I didn't get to hear the story. And I think what I heard is I tried to follow it. I think they later settled it out of court. And again, it's not I didn't, it's not like I was just interested to hear that story. But anyways, so again, a lot of people don't want to be on jury duty. I understand why, because it's a huge time commitment, and I know it's not easy for people, but it is a civic duty. It is something that we can do in this country that is that is exercising our obligations as citizens. Unfortunately, it's also oftentimes pretty demoralizing to see the jury of your peers. So it makes you never want to go. God forbid you should ever have your fate determined by a jury of your peers, because it's frightening. So I will tell you that it is dispiriting sometimes, but again, it's one of the most civic-minded things that we can really do, quite frankly, right? So, voting and being a part of the jury are two of the times when we get to exercise our rights and our powers as citizens. Anyways, so that being said, the Talmud goes on and on about how these priests and how these holy people were involved in these trials. Because again, on one level, you'd kind of say, do I want a priest on my, deciding my future? And again, the understanding here was that we're bringing everybody, we want everybody's decision here on this, including the priests. So it says, you shall carry out the verdict that is announced to you from that place that the Lord chose. Observing scrupulously all the instructions, you shall act in accordance with the instructions given to you, the ruling handed down. You must not deviate from the verdict that they announced to you, either right to the left. Should a man act presumptuously and disregard the priest charged with serving there the Lord your God, or the magistrate, that man shall die. Thus you will sweep out evil from Israel. All the people will hear and be afraid and not act presumptuously again. So again, it's telling people you have to follow, excuse me one second. You have to follow. I thought I heard the door in my house. No one else is here, so kind of scared me. Sorry. So you have to follow what that person says. You have to go along with the decision, which again assumes that doesn't always happen. That sometimes people didn't follow the decisions of the people. Now, what it's going to now get into, Shoftim, and this is the other thing that people oftentimes talk about, is this paragraph. If after you've entered the land that the Lord your God has assigned to you, and you take possession of it and settle it, you decide, I will set a king over me, as do all the nations about me, you shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by the Lord your God. Be sure not to set as a king over yourself. Be sure to set over yourself one of your own people. You must not set a foreigner over you, one who is not your kinsman. So, by the way, if you think that this is an issue that was new to the United States, which of course requires that our country is led by someone who is born in this country, not a naturalized citizen, right? Not somebody who has become a citizen here in this country, but is actually someone who was born in this country. Understand that this was established by the Torah as precedent. So to some extent, we're following the Torah on this. Now you could say, but that doesn't really make sense. How would this ever happen? Well, it does happen. It happens all the time that people that are born in another country wind up becoming president or prime minister of a country. And so this isn't theoretical. This isn't something that, this isn't something that can't happen or doesn't happen or is not. Now, again, sometimes it happens today by accident in the sense that somebody happened to have a parent that was stationed overseas and then they were born there because the person was there at that time. That happens. And again, it would be an interesting situation if it happened in this country where we end up having somebody, and we have had people who were like, well, their parents were Americans. They clearly were Americans. They just happened to be living outside of the country for a brief period of time. But I will tell you that this happens and so that situation, let me just give you an example. The current Prime Minister of England, Boris Johnson, was born in America. He was born in New York. So again, I don't think that's made him more, it happens to be very favorably inclined to the United States. I don't think that's because he was technically born in America, but he was. His parents, his father was working here at the time. So he technically, by birth, is American. So Boris was born in the United States. But, and again, then we have other prime ministers of England like Winston Churchill, whose mother was an American and who actually was more American in many ways than Boris Johnson. But United States has this rule in play because it was a problem that people who were born in other countries would oftentimes be asked to be a king of the country. And the reason was because there was so much turmoil going on in that country to some extent that the only way they could guarantee that there wouldn't be problem was by bringing in somebody from another country. And to use England as another example, England did just such a thing. When they made William and Mary king and queen of England, they brought them over from Holland. And they brought them over from Holland because they had such a mess back in their own country between the who was really, again, a legal, was the next heir to the throne, that they had to bring in somebody who was living in another country. And it turned out that William ended up doing a great job governing and ended up establishing a very stable, kind of situation in England. But there were people in England who didn't like the fact that these other people were being brought in. Look, there were people who were suspicious of Queen Victoria because of, again, her connections to mainland Europe because of her German background. So this was a real issue in England, which is kind of our closest and most understandable monarchy. But there was a real fear within Israel that those kings, that a king could wind up being a king who wasn't Jewish, who didn't have the same history, the same ethnicity, the same background as an Israelite, as a Jew. And this definitely happened as the kings of Israel married people from outside the land of Israel. It's exactly what happened to King Solomon. King Solomon married a woman who was not an Israelite, and his child, Rehoboam, her mother was not an Israelite. She was an Ammonite. She was not an Israelite. And so there was a real fear that these people, these kings, would bring in idolatry, which they did, that they bring in a sense of a lack of connection to the history of the Jewish people. And this was a real fear. And it was based on reality. Much later on, and we're talking about, for us in Jewish history, 1,000 years after King David and King Solomon, but 2,000 years ago, so it's still ancient history, was King Herod. And King Herod was a Edomite. His family was from the other side of the Jordan River. He was technically a descendant of Esau, so he was related to us. But the Edomites were not Israelites. They were not people who had experienced the bondage of Egypt. So when we talk about Passover and leaving Egypt, the Edomites did not leave Egypt. They were not people who had that consistent connection to God. By our history and by what we know, and we only know about the Edomites from our Torah, Esau was a son of Isaac. He was a grandson of Abraham, just as Jacob, but he lived a different life. And his descendant, King Herod, definitely had a problem with understanding and appreciating, to put it mildly, Jewish history, which is why he was responsible for the death and destruction of thousands of Jews, millions perhaps, if you add up how many people he destroyed or had destroyed. He killed many of the rabbis, teachers of that generation. Of course, the Christian Bible talks about his near destruction of Jesus, but King Herod was not an Israelite. He was not a Jew. And he had a very problematic situation in that on one hand, he understood the power of the priesthood, and he seems to have been close to some of the priests. He definitely didn't like the rabbis and many of the other Jews, or the Maccabees. He married a Maccabean princess, Miriam, and then had her killed, and had her kids with his kids with her killed as well. But he liked the priests, and he liked the priests so much, folks, that he built Jerusalem temple, almost rebuilt it from scratch. The beautiful temple that was destroyed by the Romans, unfortunately, only about 70 years later, was almost built from the ground up again by King Herod. That same King Herod. He built the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall that still exists. The only part of that temple that we can still touch was built by King Herod. It was built by him, not by hand, but by his laborers, by his own authority, by his own infrastructure project. He was an amazing builder, built Masada, built Caesarea, but also built the temple, and literally was almost unrecognizable from the way the temple looked before he was king. And so he put lots of money into the priesthood and into the temple, and felt that Jerusalem should have a beautiful temple, just like every great Roman city, which he loved the Romans. By the way, his great success, Herod's great success, was knowing who to pick, which side to back. And many, many years before, he had backed the right horse. He took Augustus Caesar, he took Octavian, and supported him in his battle against Mark Antony and against the other Roman leaders. And he picked Augustus, he picked Octavian, and of course he picked the winner. And Augustus never forgot that. He never forgot Herod's allegiance, and Herod was always protected by Augustus Caesar. And Augustus, of course, ruled for a very long time and made sure that Herod, his friend, was always protected and always had the Roman authorities and the Roman army at his beck and call. So that's why Herod, what made Herod so great. And by the way, it took a lot of guts to do what Herod did, because at the time that he supported Augustus, Mark Antony was over with Cleopatra in Egypt, right next door. And the fact that he had the vision and the guts and maybe even the luck to support the guy who was back in Rome was really, really lucky for him. And who knows how Jewish history would have been different if King Herod had been destroyed or replaced and Cleopatra and Mark Antony had won. History might have been very, very different. And we can only speculate. We read the story and we read the play and watch the movie and, think it's kind of entertaining. But history could have been very, very different if Mark Antony had won. But this issue of and again, that's a perfect example. Mark Antony, being made and Cleopatra's vision of Rome being ruled from Alexandria and from Egypt still gets to this issue as we're talking about. What does it mean to be ruled over by someone who is not your kinsman, someone who is not an Israelite? And this is a very real issue. Was a real issue in the ancient world, and is a real issue today. And it's one of the reasons why we as Americans take this very seriously, because we want to know that the people that we have, and again, many people loved Arnold Schwarzenegger as governor. Many people thought he would be a great leader. The issue, of course, with him was always someone who clearly loves the United States. His story is an amazing story, but the reality of being someone who was from Austria and didn't have those experiences, even though he had a wonderful immigrant experience and story of success, there was this real feeling, again, you cannot make somebody who's not born in America, who's not a Native American, you can't make them president. And we take that seriously. Obviously, we take that seriously in our country. So with that being said, there also is their behavior once they're king. Moreover, he shall not keep many horses or send people back to Egypt. to add to his horses. Since the Lord has warned you, you must not go back that way again. And I love that phrase, do not go back that way again. Don't go back to Egypt. Don't go back to them for horses. Don't go back for them for support. They're not your friend. And don't multiply your horses. Don't become like them. Don't do what they did, which is count your chariots. And of course, the person who did this as king was none other than King Solomon. Later on, King Herod did the same thing. But King Solomon was the guy who multiplied his horses. And he also did this. He shall not have many wives, lest his heart go astray, nor shall he amass silver and gold to excess. This is all stuff that King Solomon did. Everything that the Torah says here, King Solomon did. And so, was this written before King Solomon or was it written after King Solomon? The reality is, as much as King Solomon created a very stable situation for Israel, he did all the things that a king was not supposed to do. And it almost, again, is this understanding that you really, really, really shouldn't have a king to start with. And that is what happens when the Israelites come to Samuel and say, give us a king in the book of Samuel. And Samuel says, you have a king, you have God. They say, nope, we have to have a king like everybody else. And that's when Samuel says, I don't know what to do. And God says, do what they say. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. They're going to make the mistake, and there's nothing I can do but allow them to make the mistake. But the Torah does say, when that king is seated on the royal throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching written for him on a scroll by the Levitical priests. So what does the king have to have with him? He shouldn't have wives, a lot of wives. He shouldn't have a lot of gold, but he should have a copy of the Torah. This is what the king has to have, the Torah. Let it remain with him, and let him read it all of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God, to observe faithfully every word of this teaching, as well as these laws. Thus he will not act haughtily toward his fellows, or deviate, it says, from the instruction to the right or left, to the end that he and his descendants may reign long in the midst of Israel. So, if this was written before King Solomon, then Solomon broke this and was not supposed to break it. If this was written after King Solomon, it was written under the authority of a king who lived after King Solomon and who most likely was a descendant of King Solomon. The theory is that this may have been written during the time of King Josiah, who lived about 300 years after King Solomon and was a descendant of him. He was from the Davidic line. He was a Davidic king, a descendant of King David, a descendant of the kings of Judah, a king of Judah, and that he knew that his predecessors had not done an adequate job and that they hadn't been following the Torah. And that means that that king, if it was King Josiah, took on himself the understanding that he had to follow the Torah and that all of those who came after him should follow the Torah. Now here's the problem. 30 years after King Josiah, the kingdom was destroyed. The Babylonians destroyed the Judean kingdom. They exiled King Josiah's descendant, Zedekiah, and it was the end of the Judean kings. There was never going to be another king of Judah again, and Jerusalem was destroyed. The next Jewish kings we have are the Maccabees, who, again, were not supposed to be kings. They were supposed to be high priests. They eventually made themselves kings. And then, of course, King Herod married into that family and then assumed the leadership and the kingship. And then his kingship passed to his sons and grandsons. But very soon after that, the kingdom was destroyed. So listen, we had a 400-year period where the kingdom of Judea, the kingdom of Judah, the kingdom of David, the dynasty of King David ruled. And that's a very long time. 400 years is a considerable length of time, from King David to Solomon to Rehoboam, and then going all the way down to King Zedekiah. That's 400 years. That's a long time. It's a long dynasty by any stretch of the imagination. Ancient times, modern times, it's a long time. But generally speaking, for most of the last 3,000 plus years of recorded Jewish history, most of Jewish history, we have not had a king. We have not had a ruler of the Jewish people that was a hereditary monarch. The vast majority of our history, which is interesting I mean, think about it for a second. Because what other people in the world have lived most of their existence for thousands of years without a king? You can't think of them. You can't think of people that have existed for anything longer in reality than 200 years without a king, and that's the United States. There are no other people that have existed as a people, as a nation, as a not a tribe, not a family, but a country, that a nation that says, here's our borders, that didn't have a king ruling over them, having power over them, having control of them, having control of their future. We're the only people who decided, and again, somewhat by history too, that the best way to live was not under a hereditary monarchy, to not pass authority through from father to son. One could make the argument that the one area, the one place, the one sphere where there was this hereditary power, and again, I'm not talking about the priesthood, because the priesthood ceased to exist 2,000 years ago. And it was never supposed to be political power, which is why what the Maccabees did by taking political power was wrong. It was never, they were never supposed to do that. And it only existed, by the way, for about 100 years. I mean, really 80, 90 years. That's it. And it really was not real power, because the Romans let them do it for most of that time, much of that time. But the reality is, the only time in Jewish history that you can make the argument that there was some kind of authority for a significant period of time would have been the Hasidic dynasties, the Rebbes that held sway over their communities for about 100, maybe about 150 years in Poland and from Russia, Poland, in the Pale of Settlement, from about 1800 to about 1950, or right up to the Holocaust, for that about 150 years. It's the only time you can say that there was a dynasty of father to son to grandson, etc. That's the only time that we had hereditary authority. Almost every other time in Jewish history, through the rabbis, through judges, through tribal heads, through going all the way back to Moses, the authority passed by merit and by who was essentially deemed to be the people who were following God's way, and that was it was not based on who your parent was, with the exception of the Davidic dynasty for 400 years. So somehow we've made it. Somehow, folks, the Jewish people are proof that you don't have to have a king to survive, that you don't have to have authority that is passed on from father to son in order for there to be stability, for there to be continuity. So that's good to know, because right now the United States is still in its infancy, and we hope and pray that it will be able to continue in the way that it is. But we really do we don't have a lot of years of being free of a monarchy and being free of hereditary power. So the Torah understands this. They understand that power corrupts, right? And absolute power corrupts absolutely, but this is not the way that things should be. So there has to be the Torah that has supremacy over the king himself. Now we kind of move into another section in chapter 18 that starts to get back into the tribal portions. And again, maybe you could say kind of jumping around a little bit, but it says the Levitical priests, the whole tribe of Levi, shall have no territorial portion with Israel. They only live off the Lord's offering by fire as their portion. And they shall have no portion among the other tribes. The Lord is their portion as he promised them. Then this shall be due, right, for the priests. Everyone who offers a sacrifice, an ox or a sheep, must give the shoulder, the cheeks, and the stomach to the priest. You shall also give him the first fruits of your new grain and your wine and oil, and the first shearing of your sheep. So you give the priests, the Levites, the support that they need, because they don't have a tribal portion amongst you. They offer up sacrifices. They're your leaders, and they help take care of your spiritual needs. So you take care of them. For the Lord your God has chosen him and his descendants out of all your tribes to be in attendance for the service in the name of the Lord for all time. If a Levite would go from any of the settlements throughout Israel where he's been residing to the place that the Lord has chosen. So it's saying, and when that person goes to Jerusalem, he may do so whenever he pleases. He may serve in the name of the Lord his God like all of his fellow Levites who are there in attendance before the Lord. They shall receive equal shares of the dues without regards to personal gifts or patrimonies. So again, it's not based on who your father was, but as long as you're a Levite, you shall be able to go to Jerusalem and be taken care of there. Now, this is a little problematic because what it's basically doing is it's encouraging the Levites to move to Jerusalem, because it's basically saying they don't get any benefit necessarily of living in the settlements. What that, of course, is in doing is it's encouraging the Levites not to live in those settlements. It's encouraging them to come to Jerusalem and take their place and take their kind of not being out in the country. Because, of course, if they're out in the country, those Levites are offering up sacrifices in those settlements. They're not supposed to, according to Deuteronomy, but we don't hear that later on in the Torah, earlier on in the Torah. We know that was going on. We know it was going on later on in the Torah too, that the Levites were continuously offering sacrifices because that's what they did for a long time, and they didn't want to go to Jerusalem. But Deuteronomy is definitely written by people or with the intention of getting people to Jerusalem, and the Levites can go there and work there and be satisfied there. They don't have to live in those places anymore. It says, when you enter the land that the Lord your God is giving you, shall not learn to imitate the abhorrent practices of those nations. Again, we talked about this in the last few weeks. Let there be none among you who consigns a son or daughter to fire. Well, that seems pretty straightforward. Don't sacrifice your children. Or an augur, a soothsayer, or a diviner or sorcerer, or one who casts spells, or one who consults ghosts or familiar spirits, or one who inquires of the dead. For anyone who does such things is abhorrent to the Lord, and it is because of those abhorrent things, right, these things, that the Lord your God is dispossessing before you. You must be wholehearted before the Lord your God. Those nations that you are about to dispossess do indeed resort to soothsayers and augurs. To you, however, the Lord has not assigned a like. So, what does that cover? Well, this is the section that people, when they turn to the Torah and say, you're not supposed to be a wizard, that the Torah speaks against wizardry and witchcraft, this is the place. And so when people were talking about the dangers of Harry Potter, the dangers of this, the dangers of these kinds of stories, this is where they get it from. They get it from Deuteronomy. Now, my understanding of this is that there's a difference between watching this or reading this or being entertained by these kinds of things. There's a difference between that and believing in it. Now, there are people who believe in it, and the Torah is pretty strict about it, saying you're not supposed to do it. Now, there are people who get a little upset with this section, and I don't know what to tell you because it is here in the Torah. This is not just against wizardry and witchcraft. It says specifically that you're not supposed to resort to contacting the dead, which means seances and going to what we technically call necromancers. Now, again, we sometimes use that word necromancer as a wizard or as a warlock or somebody who's engaged in magic. But technically, a necromancer is someone who calls on dead spirits. I mean, that's what the word means in its origins. So there was a definite prohibition against necromancy, against using the dead for your calling on spirits for your bidding, and also, again, it seems to be here consulting the dead. There is a definite Jewish tradition that prohibits that type of work. Does it say it doesn't work? No, it didn't say that, by the way. It didn't say it doesn't work. It didn't say that at all. It didn't say it's a waste of your time. It's a waste of your money. You shouldn't do it because you're going to spend money and get a bunch of people lying to you and telling you a bunch of stuff that anybody with a basic understanding of conning people can do. It doesn't say that, though much of those people are engaged in conning. and learning subtle tricks of reading people. But it does say you don't do it. And it says you don't because the people around you do this stuff and it leads to really, really bad behavior. It might seem like it's not a big deal, but of course, it leads to things that are a big deal. And one of them, of course, that we would still say is a big deal is killing your children, burning them in a fire. Now, you could say, well, not everybody who goes to a seance is up for sacrificing their kids too. But understand that in a lot of ancient cultures, and it is literally a fine line, just a quick step over from, I believe that there's knowledge on the other side, and in order to get that knowledge from the other side, I'm going to send somebody over to the other side to get me that knowledge. I'm going to have a child on the other side protecting me. So now, again, you could say, well, it's not, for our standard, what possible logic is there to kill your child? But if you're saying my child on the other side is going to protect my family on the other side, then I can suddenly now make sense of this and wrap my head around it and go, oh yeah, you know what? Let me do that because then he'll protect us. Then my child will be over there to protect us and all my other children. And so there was a logic behind it, which people embraced. And then all of a sudden it didn't seem so crazy. Judaism has a different approach to what we think happens when somebody dies. It's not that their spirit is gone. We don't believe that they're gone at all, hardly. But what we believe is that spirit needs to be left alone. That spirit is not there to do our bidding. That spirit is not supposed to be disturbed anymore, quite frankly, by what we can also say is our petty needs, which are, give me the answer for what stock I'm supposed to pick, or how what I'm supposed to do tomorrow. You're not supposed to rely on that kind of stuff. And what happens is that the reliance on soothsaying, the reliance on spirits is eventually people lose their way and no longer are using the Torah, and they're no longer using wisdom. They're no longer using good judgment and what they know to be the right way, because now they believe that they have to follow the spirit. So there's a real understanding in Judaism that somebody who's dead is now in another existence, and that existence shouldn't be bothered by the living. Again, you can say, well, I understand why people want to contact the spirits. Look, anybody who's ever lost anybody dear to them wants to talk to that person, wants to have communication with that person. But there is a real problem understanding that there's a difference between talking and having communication and saying something to the person that we love, and then going to somebody who you're going to pay money to in 99% of the cases and say, can you contact my father, my husband, my child, and let me talk to them? Because again, what you're doing, even if the person could do this, there was a real fear. And I'm telling you, think about it logically. If you allow somebody to have an attachment to your dead relative, that then they could use that dead relative spirit for their own devices. There's a real feeling that this is just a slippery slope that you shouldn't go down. And again, they never talk about the efficacy of it. It doesn't deal with it. On the contrary, there's a lot of stories in the Talmud, and there's even the one story that we've talked about. We always talk about when we read this, of King Saul, who goes to Samuel after King Saul had killed all the witches and all the necromancers, finds the one that's still alive, the witch of Endor, and says to her, bring up Samuel's spirit. Saul says, I need to speak to him. I need to get guidance. And she says, I can't do it. And she says, I'm not supposed to. King Saul killed everybody. And he says, it's okay. I'm asking you, and she does. She brings it up. According to the Bible, she does disturb Samuel's spirit. And Samuel tells Saul, you're dead tomorrow. You're dead. You wanted an answer? I'm going to give you an answer about your war against the Philistines. You're dead tomorrow. So it didn't work out very well for King Saul. It's definitely a cautionary tale, but it doesn't say that you can't do it. On the contrary, it says you don't do it. because it is the wrong thing to do to the spirit. It's the wrong thing for you to do, and it's the wrong thing for your society to do. And you don't need to do it. You don't need to do it. Yeah. What? Sorry? Somebody was saying something. I want to make sure you get it in there. So this is a part of this Torah portion, which again talks about law at the beginning. We get into law, but very soon again we get into practices that are again almost the exact opposite. Instead of consulting the law, instead of consulting God, and again the priests and the people who are going to give you wisdom and the Torah, having the Torah there with you, you're the exact opposite to some extent is consulting wizards, soothsayers, people who are using augury, which is you looking at omens and tearing open birds and tea leaves, those kind of things. That's the exact opposite. Now it says here, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet from among your own people, like myself. Him you shall heed. So prophets are okay, right? As long as the person was again following in my footsteps. This is what Moses is saying. This is just what you asked of the Lord your God at Horeb in Mount Sinai on the day of the assembly, saying, let me not hear the voice of the Lord my God any longer, or see the wondrous fire any more, lest I die. Whereupon the Lord said to me, they have done well speaking thus. I will raise up a prophet from among them, from among their own people, like yourself. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will speak to them all that I command him. And if anybody fails to hear the words he speaks in my name, I myself will call him to account. But any prophet who presumes to speak in my name, an oracle that I did not command him to utter, or speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. Wow. So if you're a prophet, and you're a prophet that's a legitimate prophet, you got nothing to worry about. But maybe you do, because God forbid you'd say the wrong, you're not speaking anymore on behalf of God, which again, you might have been speaking on behalf of God last week, and then this week you're no longer speaking on behalf of God. You've lost the power. You know that the power, for whatever reason, has left you. Did those prophets always give up the power? Did they always recognize that the power had left them or give it up? We don't know. We can assume that they probably didn't. So this is a very tough job, because the prophecy, when it comes upon you, you probably felt really good about yourself, or maybe you were a little scared. Some of the prophets we know were scared, but you better not speak the wrong thing. You better not be speaking, no longer God's word, because the punishment is death. It's not like you get fired; you die. That's the way you get fired from being a prophet. Well, you get fired from actually saying you're a prophet, I should say. It says, now, you ask yourselves, how can you know that the oracle was not spoken by the Lord? If the prophet speaks in the name of the Lord and the oracle does not come true, the oracle was not spoken by the Lord. The prophet has uttered it presumptuously. Do not stand in dread of him. So, again, part of what a prophet does is he says something's going to happen, and then that thing happens. So, the prophet does two things. The prophet says something's going to happen and is also speaking in the name of God. So, he doesn't just say something's going to happen. He says something's going to happen, and we need to listen to God. And so the prophecy also had something, a message. So the prophecy was there. This thing will happen, but it's because you're supposed to do this, or you're not supposed to do that. So the prophecies it's really a two-parter. It's that something's going to happen, and that you're speaking in the name of God. So all the prophets that we have in the Bible, in the book of prophets, we have a whole book called Nevi'im, the prophets. All of those prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Nahum, all those people, they all had prophecies. They all came true. Now, some of those people got listened to. Actually, most of them didn't get listened to, but their words came true, and their words that they spoke were true. And so what they said happened, and what they said had a message which we needed to keep. We didn't keep their messages just because what they said happened. We kept them because also they had a message which inspired and we knew to be God's word. So the prophet had a huge job, huge responsibility, but think about what happened. We still read those words 2,600, 2,700 years ago. When did this time of prophecy end? About 300 years before Jesus. So it did not happen during the time of Jesus. During the time of Jesus, people didn't just wake up and say, oh, Jesus, he's a bad prophet. We're not going to follow him anymore. Hundreds of years before that, the Jewish people said prophecy has ceased to exist. It doesn't work anymore. Why? Most likely because they had seen too many things happen, which clearly, by that point, they deemed these aren't things that God is saying are happening anymore. Maybe you could make the argument. They could say, well, we already heard that. We already knew that. Isaiah already told us that, which is, by the way, when Jesus is speaking, he's oftentimes quoting Isaiah. It could be that, again, by the time of 250 years before Jesus, people said, well, you're going to tell us that we're going to be destroyed? We already heard that. Jeremiah told us that. Everybody, again, in those books of prophets, every one of those prophets was talking about destruction that's going to be visited on us when we don't do what we've been told numerous times to do. So it could be that, again, people felt that the prophecies had already happened, but there really was this sense that prophecy had, and again, the rabbis actually said it, that prophecy was no longer, that God was no longer sending prophets. And so it was not in response to Jesus. I want to make that real clear. Anybody who says that is just wrong. It's just historically wrong. It's not even close.
Is that why he got into trouble?
Yeah, and so one of the reasons why Jesus and a lot of other people at that time got into trouble was because people said nobody, and again, this kind of gets into this issue of what do Jews believe about Jesus. Sometimes people will say, well, he was a prophet. Well, I have a problem with that because, again, by the definition of Jewish prophecy had already finished 300 years before, so 250 years before. So by my standard, that's not what he was. First of all, he's not even called a prophet. Well, I shouldn't say he's not called a prophet. He's called a rabbi. He's called a teacher by his followers, by his disciples. So it's fair to say that he was a teacher. It's fair to say he was a rabbi, because what made somebody a rabbi? Having disciples. So I think it's fair to say that if the vision or the again, I can't really say the historical accuracy, because the Christian Bible isn't written and wasn't intended to be a historically accurate account of this, which, by the way, is not me saying it. That's what Christian writers, Christian scholars will tell you today, that it was not written to be a historical accurate account of Jesus's life. It is a midrash of Jesus's existence, whatever it was, based on the Jewish tradition of midrash. That being said, the parts that we can reconstruct would give us the idea that Jesus was a teacher who had followers, which would have made him a rabbi to his followers. Would it have made him a rabbi for everybody? Not necessarily, because there are people who I'm not a rabbi to. And there are people who would say, oh, he's a rabbi in this synagogue, or he's not our rabbi. What makes a rabbi? What makes a rabbi according to Jewish tradition? A community saying, this person's our rabbi. What we call the Maradatra, which is the Aramaic term for essentially the teacher, the arbitrator of law and the teacher of Torah in that community. So again, Jesus wasn't really speaking for most of the time as a prophet. So even his words are not what we would consider prophecies. The work of a prophet was to tell people, if you don't do this, this will happen to you. So please do the right thing. That type of prophetic voice, one can make the argument, doesn't exist unless we're in times that kind of dictate that we have to, that we enter into those kinds of periods. One can make the argument that the prophets of the Bible have said pretty much everything that you need to say. Maybe not. Maybe one day we'll come into a time in the future where there's something that can be said by a prophet who we haven't heard that before. But I haven't heard it yet. I really haven't heard anything about any historical period that somebody couldn't say, well, that's not in the Bible. No, it probably was said by one of these prophets who said, if we do this, then expect this to happen. Pretty much human behavior hasn't changed a whole lot. Our propensity for good and bad, hasn't changed. Our human, the cycles of how we go through life pretty much hasn't changed. So will it happen one day? Maybe, but we haven't entered into an existence yet that really dictates or necessitates prophets to do this kind of work. So I'm okay. I'm okay. I'm okay living in a time when we don't have prophets, because quite frankly, we'll have to have some. I mean, maybe it'll be good, but usually prophets are living at a time when things are not really good, and we're looking for some vision of, well, what'll happen if we do, this or do that. I want to just say right and wrong, but if we make good decisions or bad decisions, or what are the kinds of things? Again, there are people who'd say, well, there's, prophets of doom and gloom today, or talk about the economy, or talk about the environment, or talk about this or that. But the reality is that we know that, what we have in front of us, we don't need a prophet to tell us what we need to do for the most part. I mean, I don't think most of us are honestly searching for a prophet right now. I think most of us know what we need to do as a country, as a world. I don't think there's a lot of people searching for, what do I have to do? We know what to do. And that's, I think, what the rabbis were saying for thousands of years, which is the era of prophecy, the era of God speaking and saying, this is what you need to do through the mouth of the prophet, but still God. We would say no. Now, I'm going to say, look, LDS Church doesn't believe that. They believe that there still are prophets, and they call the heads of their church prophets because they believe that they're still being revealed the word of God. We believe that revelation to some extent comes through the Torah, and it really comes through the words that we already have. The prophets, the Bible as a whole, the Talmud as a whole, that the revelation comes about through the way, again, we understand what we have in front of us. So the need for God to intervene and to send a new message, we pretty much say we haven't needed that for 2,000 years. Will we always? I don't know. I don't foresee the time, but who knows? Maybe one day we'll have to have a prophet, and maybe it'll be for a new kind of existence that we maybe we can imagine it in science fiction, but we haven't experienced it yet. But maybe we will. Maybe that prophet will have to come forward when we have to decide whether we want to upload ourselves, our consciousness into another existence. Or I don't want to speculate, but owning ourselves or doing things that would really change our existence. I mean, maybe we will need a prophet then. But so I could say maybe I can envision a time when we need a prophet, but we're not there yet. We don't have those things yet. So with that being said, let's get into, again, when the Lord has cut down the nations whose land the Lord is assigning you and you dispossess them, you shall set aside 3 cities in the land, and we've read this before, the cities of refuge. And here we get a little bit more description of those cities. You shall survey the distances and divide the 3 parts into 3 parts the territory of the country that the Lord your God has allotted you, so that any manslayer will have a place to flee to. Now, this is the case of the manslayer. So again, we read about this in the book of Numbers, the end of the book of Numbers, and now we have some greater detail. One who has killed another unwittingly without having been his enemy in the past. For instance, a man goes with his neighbor into a grove to cut wood. As his hand swings the axe to cut down a tree, the axe head flies off the handle and strikes the other so that he dies. Clearly a case of, again, it's an accident. It's an accidental homicide, but it is death. I mean, it wasn't, the person didn't fall down. The axe didn't hit that person and they died. This is accidentally somebody caused somebody else to die. So in this case, in the cases like that, a man will be able to flee to one of these cities and live. Otherwise, when the distance is great, the blood avenger pursuing the manslayer in hot anger may overtake him and kill him. And he did not incur the death penalty since he had never been the other's enemy. That is why I command you to set aside 3 cities. There has to be one that's geographically convenient for everybody in the land of Israel. So what it's basically saying is you have to have quick access to sanctuary, to that ability to be protected, which again, by extension, we could say that people need to be able to be safe, even from somebody who has a right for vengeance. So when the Lord your God enlarges your territory, as he swore to your fathers, and gives you all the land he promised to give your fathers, if you faithfully observe all this instruction that I enjoin upon you this day, to walk with God at all times, then you shall have 3 more cities to add to the original 3. So you're going to have 6 cities. Thus, blood of the innocent will not be shed, bringing blood guilt upon you, that the Lord your God is allowing you. So again, we're talking about, we'll read a little bit further. If, however, a person who is the enemy of another lies in wait for him and sets upon him and strikes him a fatal blow, and then he flees to one of these towns, the elders of his town shall have him brought back from there and shall hand him over to the blood avenger to be put to death. You must not show him pity. Thus you will purge Israel of the blood of the innocent, that it may go well with you. So again, if somebody goes to one of those cities who is definitely guilty of murder, you have to turn them back over to the people who are going to execute them. Now, again, what we're talking about here is the right of people to have vengeance on other people. Now, we have to prevent that from becoming, a constant cycle of death. And so that's why you were able to have these sanctuary cities, because otherwise a person could kill the person and say, look, I had to take vengeance on him. And so you'd have a constant cycle of death where people would say, oh, well, he shouldn't have killed him because, he was just trying to live out his life. Well, if he can get to one of those cities, he can live out his life.
How does that relate to sanctuary cities now? They're using the same kind of words, but
it doesn't.
Something totally different.
I know it doesn't. So again, it is a misuse of the term of sanctuary, which again in the Bible meant that someone was pursuing you to kill you. So it was not being used in anything other than, again, we're talking
to save real criminals. It wasn't used to save criminals.
No. So understand that we're talking about saving life and people being able to enter into one of these places so that they were protected, not even from, again, a crime, but from accidentally killing somebody. And essentially they had to live in exile from their own city. So it's not like they got to live out a happy life after they did this. They had to live outside of their home, and they had to live in the sanctuary city. It's not an easy existence, and it's not taking it lightly. So this is not like, oh, look at this, he got into a sanctuary city. No, well, he didn't get to live in his city anymore, and he did it accidentally. But again, think about what it meant in the ancient world, where somebody didn't have, they didn't have a trial, you couldn't sue somebody. And how do you do that anyways? I mean, how do you know that somebody killed, a member of your family in a car accident, even if it was in an accident? And how do you look at that person ever again? I mean, it's understanding that this is a horrible situation. There has to be consequences, even when it's an accident. Talking about accidents, folks. You shall not move your countryman's landmarks set up by previous generation. In the property that will be allotted to you in the land, you're not allowed to change boundaries. Really interesting idea, because again, we understand that in our country. We understand that boundaries are important, and that states' boundaries are very, very important for a state. New York and New Jersey have been arguing about their state boundaries for a long time. And it is, again, something that we understand to be pretty important, our boundaries. A single witness may not validate against the person any guilt or blame of any offense that may be committed. A case can only be valid on the testimony of 2 witnesses or more. We read kind of, again, a version of this, but this is also any kind of blame, not just for murder or a criminal case, but again, in any offense. If a man appears against another to testify maliciously and gives false testimony against him, the two parties to the dispute shall appear before the Lord, before the priest or the magistrates in authority at that time. And the magistrate shall make a thorough investigation. If the man who testified as a false witness, if he has testified falsely against his fellow, you shall do to him as he schemed to do to his fellow. Thus you shall sweep out evil from your midst. Others will hear and be afraid, and such evil things will not again be done in your midst. Look, not bearing false witness, folks. People forget this. It's one of the 10 commandments. It's the one 10 commandment that I think almost everybody forgets. That, and again, kind of not coveting, and not taking the Lord's name in vain. Those three are the ones that people forget all the time. Not bearing false witness. Again, we forget that that's one of the 10 commandments. It was a very serious offense. And here in the Torah, we actually see that the person who testified falsely can be punished, will be punished the same way that they were testifying. They'll be punished along those lines if they testified falsely. Pretty wild. Nor must you show pity, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Again, it's what we read about earlier in Leviticus, in the book of Leviticus. When you take, so that's some legal stuff. We're going to come back to one more thing about legal stuff. But before we finish up today, and this is the last part of Shoftim, deals with, and something that we're going to get to in the next portion, Kitetse, laws of battle. Laws of battle. And this one has a very, very famous law of battle in it we're going to get to right now. When you take the field against your enemies and see horses and chariots, forces larger than yours, have no fear of them, for the Lord your God, who brought you from the land of Egypt, is with you. So you shouldn't be afraid, because God is with you, and you've seen much, much more you've been outnumbered, and you've had a lot more to be fearful in the past, and you should never be fearful in the future. You can understand why Jews, we're not supposed to be fearful, because God said not to be fearful, and we fought a much bigger, a much more fearsome opponent in the Egyptians. Okay, they were, again, the superpower of the time. Here's what it says, though: before you join the battle, the priest shall come forward and address the troops. He shall say to them, "Hear, O Israel," right? Shema Yisrael. Those same words that we have in the Shema. Hear, O Israel. You are about to join battle with your enemy. Let not your courage falter. So don't be afraid. Do not be in fear and panic or in dread of them. For it is the Lord your God who marches with you to do battle against your enemy, to bring you victory. So that's what the priest is supposed to do first. Go out in battle and encourage the troops and make them feel strong. So that's the job of the religious authority. But then it says, then the Shotrim, then the magistrates, or the officials, they come out. And this is what they say. Is there anyone here who has built a new house but has not dedicated it? Let him go back to his home, lest he die in battle and another dedicated. Is there anyone who has planted a vineyard but has never harvested? Let him go back to his home, lest he die in battle and another harvested. Is there anyone who has paid the bride price for a wife, who's engaged, but who has not yet married her? Let him go back to his home, lest he die in battle and another marry. So understand that the Torah says that people who are in the midst of big times in their life shouldn't be in battle. That's pretty amazing, because again, it says you're not supposed to be afraid. You're going to win. But people die, and people die in battle. And God forbid somebody dies in battle who is at a crucial junction in their life where they were being counted on or had obligations that they had to be there in that moment. If they die, it's a tragedy that's compounded on top of everything else, with everything else that they deal with. It happens, and we can't let that happen. It happens, and you have to do everything you can to make sure it doesn't happen. Okay, that all makes sense. That's all very, very compassionate. It's very powerful. You'd think, oh my gosh, that's going to take a lot of people out of battle. It doesn't say everybody who's married. It says everybody who's engaged and has not consummated that marriage. Because think about what that does to a person who, again, was supposed to be married. The fiance is waiting back there, and what happens to her now? Is she a bride? Has she been married off, or is she still, unmarried? I mean, this ambiguous situation she'd be in could really affect her life. Obviously, it affects her emotionally, but it affects, again, what happens to her as a potential bride.
So the Lord is saying, don't leave unfinished business. If you're in the middle of important business, finish it.
Exactly. And one could take, by extension, anytime you're doing something in a dangerous situation, think about, again, your responsibilities. And again, your society shouldn't put you in a situation where, you could tragically die while you still have business. That's all very powerful. But I want to show you what the next line says. The next line is even more amazing. The officials shall go on addressing the troops. Is there anyone afraid and disheartened? Let him go back to his home, lest the courage of his comrades flag like his.
Oh boy, don't infect them.
Yeah. So the Israelites were not supposed to have people in their community that were going to spread this type of, this type of fear and
Pessimism.
Yeah. And they understood that this becomes like a plague. This becomes like an infection, like you said. So rather than run that risk, get those people out of your army, get those people out of there. And again, they had a draft. I mean, they had a compulsive. Wow. You didn't have a choice, right? If you were over 20 years old, you were being called into battle. You didn't have a choice. This was a draft. But you were not supposed to have people in battle who are lacking courage. So this is pretty amazing.
It really is.
Because we understood the psychology of what goes on amongst soldiers, and that it is much more important to get those people out of the ranks who are going to again make everybody else scared, are going to cause people to be disheartened and to not be able to do something, which is a very, very, of course, it's a very difficult and to think about people who've risked their lives, defending our country. Again, people who are being called up to serve, especially at a time when they're drafted. They don't have a choice. Not that it's ever easy. I don't want to make it seem like somebody who has gone up, and again, I know we have some people on right now who are people who served our country. To some extent, it takes even more commitment to make that choice when you don't have to. Like people who've converted to Judaism, who've made that choice when they didn't have to. Those are people we recognize have something special. But in a situation where people didn't have a choice, it's even more problematic because, again, these are people who, they could cause real panic amongst other people whose courage might be not 100% and not 100% committed. So I can't stress how advanced this kind of understanding was of human psychology, of group dynamics, of again, how to keep people in any organization moving in the right direction. Because again, whenever you're forcing people to do something, again, you can take this by extension and talk about people in the workforce. Again, they're not going into battle. I don't want to equate the two. That one of them is again life or death, and is something that can't talk about how highly we've again value people who've served in the military. But when you're dealing with groups of people who do not want to be in the place where they're at, if there are other people who are not there willingly, it really causes a problem. And that goes into the workforce when people are put into a situation at work that they don't want to be in as a group. And again, it may be something that they really don't, a project that they don't really want to be on. And again, they're kind of told as a group that they have to be in it. And even if, again, they kind of understand that they have to do it. But again, somebody who really is being negative and telling people we shouldn't do this, you can't have those people in the organization. And it to some extent, folks, I've got to tell you, it really as a person who spent a good amount of time teaching in a classroom, let's face it, We've got kids oftentimes, and I'm not talking about just religious school. I'm talking about in their any classroom. There are a lot of times when kids don't want to be in school. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. They don't really have a choice, and we have some teachers who are with us too. Um, when you have a dynamic where you have kids who are maybe especially as they get into teen years, but can happen earlier, where they really don't want to be in that environment, they can be toxic. They can have a toxic effect on the entire classroom, and it's very hard. Again, what do you do? I mean, you can't. They have to be somewhere, right? But it really does. There really is something to be said for, again, making sure that students who are really being problematic, they really can destroy the learning experience for people. So again, there are a lot of ways that this can be understood and interpreted and applied. I think it makes sense because the group dynamic, it can be problematic when people are not on the same page. Let's put it that way. And when people are disruptive, let's put it that way. So then it says, when the officials have finished addressing the troops and army commanders assume control of the troops. So again, the officials are part of it, but we understand that they're not going into battle or leading the battle. It says that commanders take over, they step in, and they're now going to give the orders. It says, when you approach a town to attack it, you shall offer it terms of peace. If it responds peaceably and lets you in, all the people present there shall serve you as forced labor. Again, it doesn't say they're your slaves, but they are people you're able to bring in as forced for forced labor. If it does not surrender to you, but would join in battle with you, you shall lay siege to it. And when the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, you shall put all its males to sword. So that's a pretty strict no prisoner policy. You may, however, take as booty the women, the children, the livestock, and everything in the town in a spoil, and enjoy the use of the spoil of your enemy, which the Lord your God gives you. Thus you shall deal with all the towns that lie very far from you, towns that did not belong to nations hereabout. In the towns of the latter people, however, which the Lord your God has given you as a heritage, you shall not let a soul remain alive. So it's talking about the Canaanite cities, folks. It's saying that those cities, you've got to utterly destroy them. You must proscribe them, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. These are the Canaanite peoples. And again, we usually kind of use those words synonymously for the people that live in the land of Israel. It never happened, folks. I want to make this very strong. I said it before when we first read about these commandments. It never happened. The Israelites did not destroy everybody. Why? Well, probably because they were being compassionate and they were probably trying to make peace with these people and didn't want to destroy them. But here's what happened. They lead you astray into doing all the abhorrent things that have been done to their gods, and they stand guilty. And then you'll stand now guilty before the Lord your God. So again, most likely this was written to remind people of how we got into this problem in the first place. Right. We didn't destroy the Canaanite cities. We were left with their legacy, their worship practices, their ethical practices, or I would say their lack of ethical practices. And that's how we wound up being like we were. When in a war against a city, you have to besiege it a long time in order to capture it. You must not destroy its trees, wielding the axe against them. You may eat of them, but you must not cut them down. Are trees of the field human to withdraw before you into the besieged city? Only trees that you know do not yield food may be destroyed. And you cut them down for constructing seed work against the cities that is waging war on you until it has been reduced. So, why are we cutting down the trees? To create siege works, to make battering rams, to make catapults, to use in battle. That's why they're being cut down. But you're not allowed to cut down trees that have fruit. Those trees you will need later. So the Torah is very, very, very insightful on what has to happen when, again, you're dealing with nature. You don't treat nature like a toilet. You don't treat nature like something that is your slave. The reality is it takes hundreds of years for trees to become a forest to grow. It takes, a decade for a tree to bear fruit and to be healthy. You cannot destroy a grove of trees, which is what you need when you're creating siege works and you're creating ramps and you're creating, all of these types of battlements. You're going to kill yourself long term if you use your resources unwisely in war. And one can make the argument, by extension, we don't have trees like this anymore. We do have trees like this. We don't need them for that. Well, we also don't deforest a country, which is kind of an interesting law that, it's easy to deforest a country if you're never going to live there, by the way, folks. So when we've seen cases of that happen in American history and recent history, again, unfortunately, that is a example of the Torah kind of taking into consideration. It's really easy to destroy trees, especially ones you're never going to use, or in a place that you're never going to live. So I will tell you, and Sandy just said that we need to remember this as well with trees. Well, look, we have a tree on our city of Santa Clarita. We're supposed to remember the trees in our community. Listen, I will tell you this. The Torah recognizes that trees and resources need to be protected. And if you use all your resources in war, you're not going to have them. And again, obviously I'm making a modern comparison. If you go to war and use all your resources for war, you'll have nothing left to take care of your family. So that's the modern equivalent. If you use all your trees for battle, again, you don't have food. And if you use all your money for war, how are you going to educate your kids? How are you going to be able to take care? How are you going to be able to build bridges and to take care of your own infrastructure? So there is this understanding that we have to think about. You have to think about your own livelihood, your own survival, even as you're going into battle. You've got to think about
the wisdom is here already. The wisdom of how to live is here.
It's already here. And again, thank God we live in a place where we're not, watching this happen in battle, but it can happen in other ways. And again, we have to take a long-range solution when it comes to how we treat the environment. We can't think about what's going to happen in the next 5 years. We have to think about what's going to happen for the next 100 years. And we really have to have that kind of foresight. We have to think about it when we're building our communities. As Sandy points out, we have to think about, again, how do we create areas that will be, that will not be, too detrimental to our our long-term survival. How to build in a place where we don't have enough water. We have to have those water resources for everybody. And again, it's something that we're in a fight with the farmers in Bakersfield and in the Central Valley, because we're trying to, again, make sure we have water here, but they also need water to feed us and to make sure we have crops. So this is a big issue, folks. And again, it's we sometimes forget that this issue is going on all around us until we're confronted with it, until we realize that we only have so many resources. And we have to pick and choose to use our Torah portion. We have to pick and choose our battles wisely. And we have to engage in those battles wisely too. When we know we have to have a battle, that we do it. So we're going to finish up with the last words of the Torah portion. And again, this last chapter, the last 9 verses, the new chapter, Kitei Tzei, is going to continue with the idea of battle when you go into battle with your enemies. So the first 9 verses of the chapter, and again, the chapters and verses were put on later by Christian writers. But again, how do you break up this discussion? And we'll come back to it, as I said, next week. So we started off talking about justice, and let's see how we finish up here, which I think is why the Torah portion ends here. If in the land that the Lord your God is assigning you to possess, someone slain is found lying in the open, and the slayer is not known, the identity, your elders and magistrates shall go out and measure the distances from the corpse to the nearby towns. The elders of the town nearest to the corpse shall take a heifer which has never been worked, which has never pulled any yoke, and the elders of that town shall bring the heifer down to the ever-flowing wadi to a river, which is not tilled or sown. There in the wadi they shall break the heifer's neck. This is a very interesting kind of ritual. It's a ritual, folks, a ritual of cleansing. The priests, the sons of Levi, of the Levites, right, shall come forward. For the Lord your God has chosen them to minister to him, and to pronounce the blessing in the name of the Lord. And every lawsuit and case of assault is subject to their ruling. So again, at the end of the day, it has to come back to the priests, to the Levites. Actually, the priests, in this case, the Kohanim. That's what it says. The Kohanim, who are also Levites, but again, they're the highest level, if you will, of Levites. All the elders of the town nearest the courts shall wash their hands over the heifer whose neck was broken in the wadi. It's a very interesting ritual, okay? And they shall make this declaration: our hands did not shed this blood, nor did our eyes see it done. You can see it. When we talk about washing our hands, this is again washing our hands of this murder, of this death. Well, we assume that it's a murder, right? Absolve, O Lord, your people, your people Israel, who you redeem, and do not let the guilt for their blood of the innocent remain among your people Israel, and they will be absolved of blood guilt. Thus you will remove from your midst guilt for the blood of the innocent, or you will be doing what is right in the Lord, in the sight of the Lord. So the Torah portion began with this understanding of law, of pursuing law, and it recognizes that there are going to be times, and it just gave us one, where finding justice is going to be hard, if not downright impossible. Downright impossible. And in those cases, we must have a ritual, because God forbid the blood of the innocent should be on our hands. And so the town where the nearest body, and again, if there was a question, you have to measure it out. You have to make sure that this town really took on and understood how important this was. That they had to be absolved of this death, of this person, to make sure that the person was brought to justice, person who was responsible would be prosecuted, and that this death would not be held against the town. Now, understand how this was a religious obligation. The priests were involved in it. We took this so seriously, folks, that a murder, that a death would happen in our community, and that we wouldn't be able to find the guilty party, that we wouldn't be able to bring justice, that we wouldn't be able to find justice for this victim, that we actually have to go through a religious ritual in order to get back to a state of being okay. I don't want to say pure, but being able to live with ourselves. I mean, think about that, folks. That's where we came from. We come from a culture, we come from a religion, from a Torah that teaches us that we cannot, not only can we not stand by when someone is suffering, but when someone has died, that we need to literally be cleansed and go through a ritual, because we can't live with ourselves knowing that somebody died and we can't bring that person to justice. How do we live with ourselves, folks? And this is something that, I mean, you have to, I mean, and there are so many cases of it. There's so many times when this has happened, when we haven't brought somebody to, we haven't found justice for them.
The Holocaust.
Well, Holocaust is the ultimate example, right, of how do you bring, and that's why we're still searching out and trying to find those people. Even in their 90s, we're saying those people need to be brought to justice. So we just had a case of that in the last month, folks, where we're doing this. We have to bring those people to justice. But I want you to think about, again, in our own communities, in our own city, when we've had people who have not been brought to justice for murder, and the fact that the blood of the innocent cries out to us. And a month ago in our synagogue, when actually almost 2 months ago, in June, when we said the name, as we do every year in June for Ron Goldman, every time I say Kim's brother's name, I feel like I need, that's my ritual, and it still is something, but it's not enough to give me a sense of how do I live with myself, knowing that her brother was murdered and everybody knew it and everybody knows it. And 25 years later, over 25, it still hasn't been, there's no vindication. And it's hard for me even to talk to Kim a couple weeks ago. It's hard for me to talk to her to this day without saying I'm sorry. I don't know what else to do. She's one person that I know, but there are a lot of people who we know. Unfortunately, almost everybody knows her story because they saw her on TV. But almost all of us, understanding if we lived in Los Angeles in the 90s, I lived in LA, and to know, I didn't live in LA, by the way, I was living in New York. I was finishing rabbinical school when the verdict came down. And again, knowing that even again, 25 years later, that nobody has been brought to not brought to justice for that. It's hard for me today. It's hard for me to live with that because, again, even in such an important and public situation, that compounds the loss and the lack of justice for her. A lot of other people have suffered injustice, but very few people have suffered injustice so publicly. And so she lives in our midst, and she's a friend of mine, and she's somebody that I deeply care about. But there are many other people in this country who've suffered and who've been victims of, and their families uh, have been killed, and there's never been justice for them, and that is a stain on our entire country. And we should never, it should, our people understand that this doesn't happen without us understanding that we've failed, and we have to do something when that happens, because it's a failure on a spiritual and on a human level. And again, I don't know what else to say other than we have to pursue justice, and we never stop pursuing justice. And again, in the case of the Holocaust, we never stop pursuing justice. And in the case of victims of crime in this country, we never should stop pursuing justice, and we never should give up on it, and never say, well, too much time has passed, let's move on.
Those very good police departments have a group of detectives or officers who work on cold cases so that they can bring justice to things that were never solved.
Yeah. And you know what? It's a great point, Joyce. And we, those cold case shows and, different datelines or whatever, I'll watch those shows because I always think, like, if I could help in some way, or if I knew about, I believe that we owe it to ourselves to make sure we know about those things, because at the very least we can't live in ignorance and in blindness to this, because that compounds it, makes it even worse. Oh, I didn't know. Well, no, you do know, and
we do know.
And you're absolutely right, Joyce. Those people who work on those cold cases, those people really deserve our utmost respect, because again, a lot of those people are retired in some cases. They've gone back and they're volunteering their time to work on those cases, and they're very inspiring. That's a good place to end, by the way, Joyce, is to remind people that there are good people out there that are trying to bring justice to people. And again, at the same time, by the way, I want to say, we also want to make sure, and again, one of the Jews who've been behind the Justice Project and trying to make sure that people who are falsely convicted of crimes, that those people get out of jail. That's the other part of the justice that we have to make sure that we get those people who are falsely imprisoned, get those people out of jail too, because they're our responsibility as well. And those people need to be freed, and the people who work on those situations also need to be saluted. But again, thankfully, DNA is exonerating some people and also now convicting people many, many years later. And no one should ever have to suffer that. And again, we're just seeing people in the Golden State murder cases that are finally, getting some justice. It never is too late for justice. And again,
there's a time limit on it. Is it? The Torah doesn't give a time limit on that, do they?
No, and there's no time limit. There's no statute of limitations on murder, right? So on a murder case, you can be convicted many years later. And again, in some cases, the crimes, in some cases, we find the murderer after they're even dead. But at least the person has some comfort in knowing that there has been some justice, and at least knowledge of what happened. But it's something that nobody ever should. God forbid anybody has to deal with that, where they need to find justice and aren't able to get it or need it in the first place. I hope everybody is spared from those type of those situations where they should have to be like that.
So Rabbi, before we go to that point, in terms of closure, what you've just read to us from the passage is that taking the calf to the water, break its neck, wash your hands as a form of closure. even though it doesn't fix, it doesn't find the guilty party, having that symbolism, the symbolic act toward closure. Can you talk to that in terms of, for example, in your situation, would that give you a sense of comfort or closure, even though it's not resolved?
You know, it's an interesting thing. I mean, like I talk to Kim about it. I talk to Kim Goldman about it regularly, and what kind of closure she could have. It's tough. I mean, you know, in public case like hers, it's really tough. But
Yes.
I do think that people need to have some type of ritual of allowing. You know, I talked to her when he went to jail in Las Vegas, in the Nevada situation. I told her, look, at least he's in jail, and she says it doesn't give me any closure. It doesn't make me feel any better that he's in jail. And I understand. I mean, I was trying to make her feel better, and I was doing my best to try to say, well, at least something's happened, but it didn't make her feel good. I don't know, you know, when a person would go through this ritual for their own family, you know, for their family member, is it really for that family member? It doesn't really say that, right? So it doesn't say that the ritual isn't for the family, it's for the city, right? It's for the town.
The community.
It's recognizing that the community has to do something. I don't know what kind of ritual, communal ritual, we could do as a modern society that would give us that type of feeling like, you know, you know, it's almost beyond our comprehension. When we think about how many people are murdered every year, or how many people have died over, you know, a decade where there's not been any, you know, any movement on finding the perpetrator or the killer, it's almost overwhelming. I mean, they were talking about it in the Torah that, you know, it probably happened, you know, once every generation that a town didn't know, you know, how this person died. You know, what could a city do what could a community do in our modern era to have that kind of closure? Again, I don't know, you know, again, I don't even know how the Torah could speak to the closure that an individual has for their family member, but for a city, there has to be some kind of feeling like, I mean, in some cases, we're so beyond the ability to feel like we're giving justice to people that we don't even want to think about it. It's like, if we start thinking about it, it's going to make us so depressed and so sad and make our heads hurt that we're just going to we can't, how do we live like that? So, you know, I don't know. I mean, we are so beyond, you know, how to handle this that I don't know. I mean, I honestly, you know, I wonder sometimes, you know, I think our coping mechanism is just not to think about it. We just don't talk about it, and we don't want to think about it. And I get it. I mean, I understand. But if we had to do this, we'd be doing it a lot. And you know, I've been involved in communal rituals, or I have been involved in times when a community needed to address something like this as a community. And I'm telling you, it's hard for me to talk about it, and it probably will always be hard to talk about it because right now it only happened 9 months ago. But when we had the shooting at Saugus High School, while it's not the same situation because we knew who perpetrated the crime, and the perpetrator took his own life, so he was there was not going to be any criminal case, or there was no trial, there was nothing more to be said essentially on the crime. But the aftermath, the reality of what a community, again, thankfully a community like we have in Santa Clarita, where people actually feel a sense of obligation to their neighbor, we had to do something. And so we had a vigil, we had a community vigil, thousands of people came out, and I spoke there, and several clergy, there was 3 other pastors and myself spoke, and we all took a time to talk about what had happened. And again, it was obviously just after it happened, but there was real sense that, you know, that these young people, these children who were dead, it didn't have to be like this, that, you know, this was not the way things were supposed to be, obviously. And again, you know, people point to this issue or that issue, or if we did this or we did that. But my message to the community was not, you know, we need this kind of legislation, or we need that kind of later, or this needs to happen, or that. But what I said is that we failed as a community to protect our young people. And what we failed in this case to do is we failed, and it was very obvious, it wasn't a secret, is we had a child who had a serious mental health issue, mental wellness issue, and he fell through the cracks. And he fell through the cracks to such an extent that this was, and I don't say this lightly, this was a preventable tragedy. And so what I had said to the kids there was, I had said, we have failed you as a community to protect you, because that needed to be said. Whatever else needed to be said, I needed to say to the kids, we have failed you. We failed to protect you. And what I would say further beyond that is and again, we have an obligation as a society to listen and to hear and to be responsive to young people and people of all ages who are suffering. And this young person had suffered the loss of his own father just months before. And he was on the radar. People knew that he was a child at risk. And he was a good kid. He was involved in scouts. He was involved in activities. He had friends. He was not a child who, this did not have to happen. But he had suffered a terrible tragedy at home. And it was well documented. And yet people were treating this child like nothing had happened. And they weren't listening to the warning signs, and they weren't helping him in any substantial way. And I do honestly feel that if he was not in a school with 3,000 kids, that somebody, and if there had been a high school counselor, a guidance counselor, or somebody who would help them, who helped know what was going on with the students, that somebody could have done something here. It was a preventable tragedy. And I know, because I was involved with, to a very minor, tangential level with his family, we knew that his sister went to our charter school, went to Einstein Academy, and we were able to identify 4 years before the fact that she was cutting herself, and we were able to get her help. Now, she eventually left the school, but we were able to identify and get her help when she needed it. I don't know that her brother would have followed the same path, the same exact trajectory, but if he had been in a school with 600 students instead of 3,000 students, that maybe there would have been somebody who could have heard what he needed. And then on top of it, the Hart High School District, for the last 4 months or 5 months since this quarantine, completely shut down, ironically, Kim Goldman, the very woman who suffered this tragedy, runs the SCV Youth Project. For the last 5 months now, since March, they have not let her be in contact with any of the students that her organization was counseling for the last 5 months. So thank God they're not in school. Thank God they're not in an environment where they'd actually maybe be dealing with, with their, thank God they didn't go back to school, because nobody's checked in on those kids for the last 5 months. And I guarantee you, not one of those kids is better off now than they were 5 months ago. Not one of those kids is going to emerge out of isolation and quarantine better than they were 5 months ago. So, until we figure this out, I'm just telling you, I don't want these schools to open until we know what's going on with these kids. And as of at least 2 weeks ago, she was still not allowed to contact these kids. So nobody, from what I can see, has had any contact with the kids who are at risk. Through, again, the SCV Youth Project is one of those outlets. The high schools obviously also have counselors on staff, but minimal. So who's checking in on these kids? Who knows what's happening to these kids over the last 5 months? She doesn't know. I know that. At least as of 2 weeks ago, she's not allowed to talk to them. The school wouldn't let her talk to them.
Candace's son, who was just missed being where this all happened, posted something on his Instagram just the other day about it again. So it's right at the top of his emotions and feelings. And his friend Andrew was the one that was shot in the leg. They're in the Young Marines together. And the other boy that was killed, he knew. So it's devastating. And we do need a lot more counseling or a lot more help for kids in schools.
I don't understand.
All kids.
I don't understand why this is. There's no political issue with this. There's nothing. Everybody should understand that our youth is at risk right now because, again, there is no way for people to have access to the kids right now. And again, we have laws that somehow prevent people from actually being able to contact, and be in contact with these kids? What is being protected? What is being protected? Because it's not the kids, it's not society. Is it some idea that we're invading someone's civil rights by helping them? I don't understand how this is happening. I really don't understand. And I'm telling you, I don't want to be right about this. I do not want to be right about this. But if something doesn't happen to deal with what just happened over the last 5 or 6 months, and by the time these kids go back to school over the last year, folks, we're going to have a much worse situation than we had back this past November. So I don't know how many people have to die for people to know what's going on, but we've had suicides over these last few months, and they're not being reported because the kids aren't at school. So I'm just telling you, I'm praying for our community, and I don't know what else. So getting back to what the ritual will be, I hope I'm wrong. I hope I don't have to do another ritual like I did back in November, because it was one of the hardest moments in my life to have to talk to the kids in our temple. One of them, who, as you know, Zoe, spoke to our synagogue right afterwards and talked about how she helped to save lives. But I don't know what to do, because I've got no ritual to deal with the level of damage that's happening to our kids right now. And there are some remarkable kids out there who are working real hard to stay sane and to stay positive. But I don't know.
The politicians.
Man, I talked to Joyce about this. We had a 17-year-old who walked in front of a truck a month and a half ago. Dina's roommate's brother, who was at Hart High School. He was 17 years old. He was going to be a senior this year, and a month before he went back to school, he stepped in front of a truck on the 405 freeway, and ended his life. And this didn't have. I'm telling you, this did not have to happen. And I had to see his sister that night. I couldn't say anything. I just cried. I just said, I'm sorry, but I couldn't. What do you say? I mean, I don't know what's going to happen, folks. I don't know what's going to happen in 5 more months. I don't know how we're going to bury our heads on this. And again, I don't have the easy solution to it, but not doing anything, not letting these kids have somebody to speak to is not the answer. So I know that's not the answer. I know that's counterproductive, and I know that's going to wind up, we're going to see more death. And for for Mihal, who just died, I don't know what to say. I mean, I feel like our society, again, you want to talk about a ritual? I don't know. We had a funeral for him 2 weeks ago, at the end of July, but I don't want to have any. I didn't bring me closure, as you can see. I'm again, he wasn't a member of the temple. I mean, he was a member of our family group. My daughter's family, friend group, and his sister Natalia has been a roommate for 2 years, and Dina was very close to this young man. I don't know. I don't want to see it happen again, but I'm very worried. So anyways, sorry to kind of end on this sad note, but again, we don't like to end on a sad note, but again, we cannot have the blood, as this Torah says, we cannot have the blood of the innocent on our hands. And I don't know how much more you can get the blood of the innocent as a 17-year-old, 15-year-old, whatever, the kids who died at Saugus, 14, 15-year-old kids. I can't get much more innocent than that blood. So let's hope that our kids in our community and our kids around our country are safe, and we got to do our part. We got to listen to them and make sure we have people that we're listening to them, and we got to do our part to help with a mental health crisis in this country. So with that, please stay safe and positive and healthy, and we'll see you hopefully in the coming days in person. And we're working hard on high holidays, folks. It's a month away. Rosh Hashanah is technically a month from today. So the countdown has begun. On the Jewish calendar, our month of Elul begins on Friday, or tomorrow night. Thursday night is the first day of Elul. So I'll wish everybody on a happier note. I'll wish everyone Rosh Chodesh Tov, and hopefully this last month of the year will give us strength and give us some extra energy. So please, everybody, stay safe and healthy, and stay positive, stay good.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, take care.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Night.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Night.
you.
Everybody, good night.